Look, I'm going to tell you about something that happened in the Dakota territories in 1887, and it's going to bother you. It's going to bother you for the same reason it bothered the entire settlement that made this decision, because sometimes the people who are right are the ones we exile. My granddad used to say that progress looks like failure until you understand what was actually happening. This is that story. The settlement had exiled her on the worst day of the year, October 15th, 1887. 2 weeks before the first permanent snow began to fall. Not a summer exile where you might make it back somehow. Not a spring exile where you could hunt and gather your way through. But autumn, the season that closes the door on survival. The settlement council made this official at noon, and by sunset, she was gone into the prairie with whatever she could carry. A blanket, some bread that was mostly hardtack, a knife, and here's the thing that nobody paid attention to, a coil of copper wire wrapped around her arm. Her name was Vera, and she was 14 years old. Now I need to explain something about Vera that the settlement didn't understand, because if they had, the entire story ends differently. The settlement had accused her of theft, serious theft. They said she'd stolen copper wire from the blacksmith stores, from the settlement's collective supplies that were supposed to be used for tools and repairs. Theft was a crime that genuinely endangered the community. Tools were survival, and copper was valuable. So, when the blacksmith pointed at Vera and said she'd taken wire, the settlement acted fast. But here's what the settlement didn't know when they threw her out. She wasn't a thief at all. She'd been conducting an experiment. Let me back up about 3 months. Vera's mother worked as a seamstress and textile maker for the settlement. Her father had died 5 years earlier during a failed cattle drive. So, Vera helped her mother learn to work fabric, to understand how heat moved through material. But Vera wasn't just learning textile work. She was watching. She spent hours in the blacksmith shop doing tasks, sweeping, organizing, helping with menial work. And she was watching how heat moved. She was watching the blacksmith work copper, watching it conduct warmth, watching how it responded to fire. She'd stand there, covered in soot, fascinated by the way a piece of copper that was cold to the touch just moments before would suddenly carry heat down its entire length when one end got close to the fire. Now think about this for a second. Most 14-year-olds in 1887 on the frontier were thinking about survival, finding food, staying warm, helping with basic tasks. But Vera was asking the second-order question. She was asking, how does heat actually travel? How can we move warmth from one place to another more efficiently? She'd noticed something about the settlement's heating situation that nobody else had noticed, or at least nobody had acted on. They were wasting heat, they were burning wood like it was infinite, and most of that heat just went up the chimney or dissipated into walls. She'd watched the thermometer that one of the older settlers kept, just a simple mercury thermometer mounted on a cabin wall, and she'd noticed that the room temperature barely changed, even when they were burning wood at a rate that consumed half a cord per day. The heat was escaping. It was there, and then it was gone. One evening in July, she asked the blacksmith if she could have some scrap copper wire. Just scrap. Pieces he was going to throw away anyway. The blacksmith was named Ulrich, a man in his late 50s, with the kind of hands that had been burned and scarred so many times he barely felt pain anymore. He was sorting through a pile of metal waste near his forge, twisted nails, bent iron rods, fragments of copper that had broken during work. He said yes, assuming she wanted to make something decorative, or that she'd forgotten about it by morning, like most kids did. She didn't forget. Vera began an experiment in a small space behind her family's cabin, a kind of storage alcove with a corner fireplace. She set up a frame made of wood. Nothing complicated, just branches lashed together with twine, forming a rough rectangle about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. She wrapped copper wire around this frame in a specific pattern, spacing the wires about 3 inches apart. The metal caught the light in a way she found beautiful, each strand reflecting the firelight. At one end, she positioned it so that heat from a fire could reach it. At the other end, she positioned it to radiate into the cabin's main room. She was testing whether copper wire could move heat more efficiently than the stone and brick that the settlement's hearths were made from. She'd run her fingers along the wire after it had been warmed, feeling how the heat traveled so smoothly from one end to the other. It was elegant. It made perfect engineering sense. And it worked. It actually worked. But here's where it gets insane. When Ulrich the blacksmith found out what she'd been doing with his scrap copper, when he realized she'd taken more copper from the communal stores without asking, specifically 22 feet of wire that he could account for missing, he got angry, not because the experiment was stupid, but because it was smart in a way that scared him, because a teenage girl in the settlement had just proved something about heat that challenged how the settlement had been heating themselves for 2 decades. Because she'd done something original, something without permission. He'd actually seen the wire frame when he was looking for something in her mother's area, and she'd tried to explain it to him. He'd dismissed her explanation as the confused rambling of a girl playing with shiny objects. But the more he thought about it, the more he understood that she wasn't confused at all. She understood thermal conductivity better than most men he knew. He reported the theft to the settlement council. The council was headed by a man named Birger, and Birger was what we'd call old guard practical. He'd led the settlement through hard years. He'd made decisions that kept people alive through hunger, through prairie fires, through the winter when disease came through and killed 6 people in 2 months. But he operated from a place of tradition and control. When Ulrich reported that a girl had been taking copper wire for some kind of experiment, Birger's response wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. It was protection of order. His first words were, "What was she trying to do?" And when Ulrich said, "I'm not entirely sure, something about moving heat more efficiently," Birger just shook his head and said, "Then she's acting outside her understanding and stealing community resources to do it." The priest, a thin man named Torsten, who'd come to the settlement 8 years earlier and who'd never quite fit with the practical demands of frontier life, supported the exile immediately. He saw Vera's independence, her questioning, her willingness to experiment without permission as dangerous. He saw it as a girl who didn't know her place, a girl who was becoming a problem. In his position as spiritual leader, he saw moral implications in her behavior, the decision to work secretly, the taking of resources without explicit consent, the presumption that she understood something the community didn't. He said something to Birger about the corruption of humility, about the dangers of unchecked intellect in young women. They held a trial on October 15th. I use the word trial generously. It was a hearing. They brought Vera to the settlement meeting house, a building made of stacked logs with a fireplace that dominated one wall. The fire was burning hot that day, and the irony of that wasn't lost on anyone who was paying attention. Maybe 40 people gathered. Vera's mother was there, increasingly frantic, clutching a handkerchief. The blacksmith was there, looking uncomfortable. The priest was there, composed and certain. And Birger sat at a wooden table like a judge, with papers in front of him, documenting the missing copper. Ulrich testified that Vera had taken copper wire. When he was asked directly if it was theft or permission, he hesitated. He said something like, "She asked once. I said yes to scrap, but she kept taking more, so either she took it without asking again, or she thought my initial yes covered everything. But it's gone from the communal stores, and I can't account for it. The settlement relies on that copper for repair work. If anyone else starts taking what they think they need without asking, the system breaks down." Vera tried to explain. She stood there, 14 years old, thin enough that her collarbones showed through her dress, her hands marked with calluses and small burn marks from tending the test fire. She tried to tell them about the experiment, about heat conduction, about how copper moves warmth more efficiently than their current system. She was trying to show them that she'd been trying to solve a problem, not commit a crime. She said, "I measured the temperature inside the space with the copper wire system versus the temperature inside spaces with just the fireplace. The wire system maintained a temperature that was consistently 15 to 20 degrees warmer with the same amount of wood being burned. That's not accidental. That's physics. That's engineering. If the settlement is burning through firewood at an unsustainable rate, and if winter is getting harder, then this matters." But Torsten the priest interrupted her. He said something I wish I had the exact words for, but the testimony recorded it as, "This girl has shown pride. She's conducted secret work. She's taken what wasn't hers without full consent. These are the behaviors of a person who sees herself as above community law. This will spread. Other young people will think they can ignore authority if she's not punished. She needs to be sent away. The settlement's survival depends on order, on everyone knowing their place and following the structures that keep us alive. This girl threatens that." Berger agreed. He said the settlement couldn't afford theft, couldn't afford people acting independently, couldn't afford uncertainty about who was taking what from the collective stores. He said exile was necessary. And by noon that same day, Vera had 20 minutes to gather her things and leave. Her mother begged them. Actually wept and begged them not to do this. She said Vera had been trying to help, that she was brilliant, that she shouldn't be punished for trying to solve a problem. She said things like, "She's not a thief, she's my daughter. She's smart enough to be something important. Please don't take that from her." She stood in front of Birger's table and made herself small with desperation, but the settlement had made its decision. Vera's mother could have left with her, nobody would have stopped her, but she had other children, a life in the settlement, work and community, so she watched her 14-year-old daughter be exiled from community. Vera took the copper wire with her. She'd hidden the main spool before the exile decision was made, wrapped it tight in canvas and buried it in a corner of their storage area. And when she left, carrying her blanket and her hardtack and her knife, she carried it too. She walked east into the prairie, away from the settlement's direction, because walking toward them would have been noticed and potentially stopped. She had maybe 3 hours of walking before the sunset. The light draining from the sky in that way it does in autumn, quick and final. She had a blanket, hardtack, a knife, and the copper wire, about 90 feet of it, carefully coiled so it wouldn't catch on things. Her feet hurt within the first hour. By the time full darkness came, she could barely see the prairie grass in front of her. She found a depression, a slight dip in the landscape that had probably been made by deer bedding down over years, and lay down there with her blanket pulled tight. The first night she slept in this depression in the prairie, pulled her blanket over her head, and tried not to think about her mother. Now, here's what I need you to understand about survival in the Dakota territories in October. The temperature was maybe 45 degrees at night. Not pleasant, but survivable if you have any kind of insulation. But in 3 weeks, that temperature was going to drop steadily. By November 15th, you'd be looking at 20 below average nights. By December, you'd be looking at -20, -30. And the winter of 1887 in Dakota was one of the hardest in recorded history. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that stopped your breath and made your lungs burn. The kind of cold where exposed skin froze in minutes. The kind of cold where if you made a single mistake, you died. Vera didn't have a lot of options. She could potentially make it back to another settlement. There was a trading post about 40 miles south, but that would take 4 or 5 days of walking. And if someone from her settlement found her on the way, they might force her back for some kind of worse punishment. She could try to survive on the prairie through the winter, which was theoretically possible, but practically almost impossible without adequate shelter and heat. Or she could do what she actually did. She could build a shelter, and she could use what she knew about copper and heat to keep herself alive through the winter. She could take this exile and transform it into something that mattered. About 8 miles east of the settlement, there was a ravine with a creek running through it. Vera found this by pure luck. She was following water, knowing that a creek meant fresh water and potentially better shelter. The ravine had a southern-facing slope and a little overhang of rock where the creek had carved away some soft stone over probably 1,000 years of water flow. It wasn't a cave, but it was something. It was protection. It was a place where wind would be broken and where the south-facing position meant the rare winter sun would actually warm the space during the day. She spent her first week building. She gathered fallen branches and created a framework around the overhang, creating a structure that was maybe 6 feet wide and 5 feet deep at its widest point. She insulated it with grass that she pulled from the prairie, the kind that's dry and dead in autumn and makes excellent insulation when packed tight, and anything she could find that would trap air, down from milkweed pods, cedar boughs, even strips of fabric torn from her own clothing. She positioned her fire very carefully at the opening where the smoke would go out, but the heat would reflect back into the space. She knew fire was dangerous. Fire consumes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide, and in an enclosed space you can suffocate. She'd been around Ulrich's forge long enough to understand this, so she positioned rocks in a careful pattern that would contain the fire but also create a draft that would pull outside air in toward the flames and push smoke out toward the opening. But then she did something genius. My granddad used to say that the real engineering happens when you solve two problems with one solution. Vera took the copper wire. She unwound it carefully from its spool over the course of a full day, laying it out on the ground so she could see the whole length of it, and she created a system that wrapped around the hottest part of her fire, actually wrapping it around heated stones that she'd buried in the hottest zone, not directly in the flame itself, and then spiraled this copper wire up and around the interior of her shelter, positioning it in loops at different heights so that it would radiate heat into every corner of the space. She used small stones and twine to hold the wires in place. It was meticulous work. It took her 3 days to get right. This is thermodynamics, okay? Copper has incredibly high thermal conductivity. At room temperature, copper transfers heat about 400 times faster than air. When you heat one end of a copper wire, the heat travels down the entire length almost instantly, actually traveling through the copper at about 300 feet per second. What Vera was doing was creating a radiator. She was taking the heat from her fire and distributing it throughout her entire shelter using the thermal properties of copper. The heat would travel down the wires and radiate outward from every point along their length, warming the air and the rock walls evenly, instead of creating hot spots near the fire and cold spots far away. Did she understand it at that level of physics? No, she was a 14-year-old girl in 1887 without formal scientific education. But she understood it the way engineers understand things, through observation, experimentation, and trial and error. She'd learned it by watching the blacksmith, by testing her first system behind her family's cabin, by understanding on an intuitive level how materials respond to heat. She understood the principles, even if she didn't know the name thermal conductivity. By early November, she had a system working that was keeping her alive. She measured temperatures using a stick marked with increments that she'd created by comparing it to the settlement's thermometer during her evening walks before the exile. She kept careful records scratched into bark. Temperatures were dropping steadily. By the 1st of November, nighttime lows were in the teens. By November 15th, they were regularly hitting 20 below. But inside her shelter, with her copper wire radiator system running, she was maintaining temperatures around 40 degrees. 40 degrees is uncomfortable. 40 degrees is cold. But 40 degrees won't kill you if you have insulation and a blanket. 40 degrees lets you survive. She hunted rabbits. She'd learned trapping from her mother's side of the family. Her grandmother had been part Lakota and had taught her mother the old ways before she'd married into the settlement. She stretched and dried them carefully, made herself clothing from the hides, tanning them with wood ash and brain matter in the traditional way. She gathered roots and dried plants, stored them in bark containers. She read the land for food sources the way her grandmother had taught her mother, who'd taught her. And every night she tended her fire and her copper wire system, adjusting the position of the wires where they'd shifted, cleaning out ash that had accumulated, making sure everything was working as efficiently as possible. She kept her shelter organized with the precision of an engineer. Every tool had a place. Every piece of material was tracked and accounted for. She understood that survival in this space depended on systems, on discipline, on knowing what she had and how to maintain it. Back in the settlement, winter was hitting different. The Dakota winter of 1887 to 1888 was becoming legendary before it even ended. The snow started in November and didn't stop. By mid-December, there were drifts 18 feet high. The temperature on January 10th dropped to minus 42 degrees. That's not minus 42 with wind chill. That's the actual temperature. The kind of temperature where exhaled breath crystallizes before it hits your face. The kind of temperature where metal becomes brittle and shatters, where ink freezes in its bottle, where whiskey turns to slush. The settlement had built their heating system on the traditional model. Large, central fireplaces in the main rooms of cabins, stone and brick construction that was beautiful but inefficient. Lots of fuel burned, most of it wasted. They'd brought in what they thought was adequate firewood for the winter. They had maybe twice as much as a normal winter would require, and they burned through it in 6 weeks. The settlement's blacksmith had done the calculation. At the rate they were burning wood, they'd run completely out by late January, and February would still be the coldest month. By early January, the settlement was in serious trouble. Birger, the council head, was rationing fuel. He was allowing families only so much wood per day, about 1/5 of what they normally would have used. It wasn't enough. In the coldest part of January, when the temperature dropped to minus 40, where cabins that only had one fireplace were becoming dangerously cold, the temperature inside some buildings was dropping to the low teens at night. That's freezing. That's dangerous. Children were getting frostbite on their fingers and toes. One elderly man, named Henrik, got pneumonia and died. The settlement's children stayed pressed together in the warmest room they could find. Parents stuffed hay and grass into the walls of cabins in a desperate attempt to add insulation. People were burning furniture. They were burning anything that would burn, and they were still cold. The settlement was starting to realize they might not make it through the winter. It was Vera's mother who brought her up first. She came to Birger in early January and said something like, "My daughter told us she'd figured out a better heating system. I didn't believe her at the time. I thought she was just trying to explain something complicated. But we're running out of wood and out of time. I don't know if what she said was true or if I'm just desperate, but she's not exiling us. We are. Maybe we should ask her to help." Birger dismissed her. He said Vera was a thief and an exile, and that consulting her would be admitting they'd made a mistake. This is the thing about pride in survival situations. Pride gets people killed. Birger was a good leader in stable times, but he didn't have the flexibility to admit that the situation had changed, that the rules they'd made had been based on assumptions that were no longer true. But desperation is stronger than pride, eventually. It was the Norwegian settler, a man named Ketil, who'd arrived in the settlement about 3 years earlier and who'd spent his younger years in Norway before immigration, who actually changed things. Ketil had been watching the settlement's heating struggles with the growing horror of someone who'd lived through this before. And he said something to Birger that apparently made an impression. He came to Birger and said, "I've seen people freeze to death in Norway before. I've watched it happen. I've held the bodies of neighbors when the cold took them, and I've also seen people with smart heating methods who survived winters that killed others. Pride's not going to keep your children warm." A 14-year-old girl with a heating system might. By mid-January, with 3 deaths in the settlement and temperatures still at minus 20 to minus 30 at night, with children shaking uncontrollably under blankets and the food stores running low because people's bodies were using more calories, just trying to stay warm, Birger agreed to send out a search party, not to apologize to Vera or admit they were wrong, just to see if she was alive and if she actually had something that worked. Now, think about how dangerous this is. It's January, it's minus 20 degrees, it's midday, so maybe an hour or two of grey light. 4 men, bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, went looking for a girl they'd exiled into the prairie. They rode horses as far as they could. Their horses were suffering too, their breath forming ice crystals, their hooves sometimes breaking through the crust of snow. Then they walked the rest of the way. They had maybe 6 hours before darkness made them turn back without any realistic chance of finding her. They brought rope and blankets and what food they could carry, because if they found her, bringing her back alive would be priority 1. They found her because her shelter had smoke rising from it. When they first spotted the ravine, they thought they were seeing things. Smoke rising steady and consistent in the middle of nowhere. Smoke meant fire. Smoke meant someone was alive down there. They made their way down the slope carefully, holding onto brush and stone to keep from sliding on the ice. They saw the shelter, a structure that looked part cave, part lean-to, with a careful framework of branches and insulation that was so precise it almost looked intentional in a way that was hard to describe. They saw a fire burning at the entrance, controlled and efficient, the flames contained and directed. And they saw Vera appearing even thinner than they remembered, but alive, moving around with purpose. She was restacking firewood near the shelter, her movements deliberate and efficient. The men, and I want to be specific about this because it's important, they stood there for a moment not knowing what to do. They'd come ready to either find her frozen dead or huddled barely alive. They did not expect to find her not just surviving, but with what was obviously an intentional, functioning, engineered heating system. The lead man was Halvard, who was Birger's cousin and who'd lived on the frontier longer than almost anyone else in the settlement. Vera saw them, and I imagine she had a moment of pure fear. These were men from the settlement, men who'd watched her be exiled 3 months earlier. This could mean anything, from rescue to additional punishment. She straightened up, her hand gripping the piece of firewood she was holding. But Halvard, who was old enough to remember more traditional building methods from the old country, who'd lived through winters that tested the methods and found some of them wanting, he stepped forward and said something like, "Girl, we need to know what you've done here." Vera showed them. She walked them through her system with the precision of someone who'd had 3 months to think about it, to refine it, to understand every detail. She explained how she'd wrapped copper wire around the fire and through the shelter to distribute heat. She showed them her fire management system, how she'd positioned stones to retain heat, how she'd insulated the shelter with grass and branches. She showed them her temperature records scratched into bark. She explained thermal conductivity, in simple terms, how copper carries heat better than stone or brick. She showed them how her shelter was maintaining a temperature that would keep someone alive through the winter. And Halvard, who understood engineering from necessity, who understood what good solutions looked like because he'd lived with bad ones, he understood what she'd done before she'd finished explaining it. He walked around the shelter, examining the way the copper wires were positioned, the way the heat distribution was even throughout the space. He said, "This is brilliant. This is absolutely brilliant." But there was a practical problem. Vera couldn't save the entire settlement by herself. What she'd done worked for one person in a small shelter. The settlement needed to heat multiple cabins and keep multiple families alive. The shelter was about 6 feet by 5 feet. A settlement cabin was twice that size, sometimes larger. Vera said, "I'll teach you." Those 4 words. Let me pause here, because this is the moment where everything changes. This is the moment where a 14-year-old girl who'd been exiled as a criminal, who'd been left to survive alone on the prairie, chooses to help the people who'd rejected her. Not because she had to, not because she would benefit, not because they'd asked for her forgiveness, but because the alternative was letting people die. Because she understood that the problem was bigger than her anger, and because solving problems was what she did. They brought her back to the settlement, not as a triumphant hero. The settlement wasn't capable of that kind of grace, wasn't capable of the magnanimous celebration that would have acknowledged the injustice of the exile, but as a resource that was desperately needed, a girl who was suddenly valuable because she possessed knowledge that could save lives. Vera's mother cried when she saw her. She'd aged visibly since October. Her face was thinner, lined in ways that hadn't been there before. They embraced in front of the settlement, and even Birger didn't try to stop it. Some of the other settlers looked away, uncomfortable with the reunion, uncomfortable with the reminder of what they'd done. Over the next 4 weeks, Vera taught the settlement how to implement her heating system. She worked with Ulrich the blacksmith to bend and shape copper into larger configurations. They had to create loops and spirals that would fit inside the cabin walls, that would distribute heat evenly. She calculated the amount of copper needed for different sized spaces. She'd learned the geometry of fire and heat by trial and error in her own shelter. She worked with the men to modify the main cabins, running copper wire in spirals around the fireplaces and through the interior walls. She showed them how to insulate the walls differently, how to create channels for the copper that wouldn't catch on things. She showed them how to manage the fire to maximize heat radiation into the copper and minimize waste up the chimney. The fire needed to be hotter, more focused, with stones positioned to catch the hottest heat and transfer it to the copper. It wasn't a perfect system even then. Copper wire was limited, and they couldn't retrofit everything. But she prioritized the spaces where children were sleeping. That was priority one. The storage areas where food was kept. That was priority two. The meeting house that was becoming a warming shelter for people whose individual cabins couldn't stay warm enough. That was priority three. By February, the settlement's crisis had shifted. People were still cold. February in Dakota is always brutal, but they weren't dying. Children weren't developing frostbite anymore. The cabin temperatures were staying in the 20s and low 30s instead of dropping to the single digits. People weren't collapsing from hypothermia. The death rate stopped. Vera worked alongside the blacksmith nearly every day. Ulrich had fully recognized what he'd misunderstood before. He'd spent 3 months thinking about her explanation, about what she'd been doing in the test system behind her family's cabin. He became her ally and her advocate. He spent hours with her, learning her reasoning, understanding her methodology. He started making suggestions. What if they shaped the copper differently? What if they increased the density of wires in one area? What if they used different stones for heat retention? They worked together as collaborators. Just being rebellious when you took the copper. I didn't understand you were actually trying to solve a problem. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I reported you. If I'd understood what you were doing, I would have helped instead of accused. Vera said, and I'm quoting this from settlement records. I should have explained it better. I should have shown you the experiment instead of hiding it. I was scared that you'd say no, so I just did it anyway. But that wasn't fair to you. You were right to question where the copper was going. That's remarkable grace for a 14-year-old who'd been exiled and could have easily held resentment. That's remarkable emotional maturity. But it also shows something important about Vera. She didn't blame the settlement for misunderstanding her. She understood that communication was part of the problem. That making other people understand your ideas is part of being right. That you can't ask people to accept ideas they don't understand. By spring, when the worst of the winter was over and the temperatures began rising again, when the snow started to melt and people could move around freely without fear of freezing, the settlement had a decision to make. Vera was now famous within the settlement and in the broader community. A neighboring settlement had heard about the girl with the heating system, and they'd sent 2 people over to learn from her. Word was spreading across the Dakota territories. People wanted to know how to build these systems. Berger called another meeting. This time, it wasn't a trial. It was a recognition. He formally retracted the exile. He officially acknowledged that what Vera had done was engineering, not theft. He apologized to her in front of the settlement, and while his words weren't perfect, he focused a lot on how the settlement's decision had ultimately worked out. He did acknowledge that she'd been treated unjustly, and he asked her what she wanted to do next. Vera had an answer ready. She'd been thinking about this apparently for weeks. She said she wanted to keep learning. She wanted to understand more about heat and energy and materials. She said she wanted to work with the blacksmith formally as an apprentice, an unprecedented opportunity for a woman in the settlement. She said she wanted to document her heating system in careful detail so that it could be built in other settlements, in other territories, so that other people wouldn't have to suffer through winters like this one. The settlement agreed. They couldn't pay her much. They were a frontier settlement with limited resources, and even after that winter, money was scarce. But they could give her a space to work, materials to experiment with, and the apprenticeship she wanted. They gave her a small building next to Ulrich's blacksmith shop, and they provided her with copper and supplies. It was recognition, finally. Imperfect, limited, but real. Over the next 5 years, Vera became something extraordinary. She refined her copper wire heating system. She experimented with different wire gauges, with different spiraling patterns, with different ways of positioning the stones that absorbed heat from the fire. She created designs that could be scaled to different cabin sizes, One configuration for small spaces, another for larger cabins, another for public buildings. She worked with Ulrich to create standardized copper components that could be manufactured more efficiently so that other settlements could implement the system without having to invent it themselves. And she began teaching others, women and men. She taught a girl who was maybe 12 years old, who was fascinated by engineering the way Vera had been, who would go on to become a builder herself. She taught 3 boys who wanted to become blacksmiths or engineers. She taught Kettle, the Norwegian settler, techniques that he'd carry back to his own community. The knowledge spread, not through formal institutions. There weren't formal institutions for this on the frontier, but through people. Through settlements sharing information with other settlements, through Vera's written notes that were copied and passed on, carefully preserved, because people understood how valuable this knowledge was. By 1895, heating systems based on Vera's principles were being built in settlements across the Dakota territories and into Montana and Wyoming. People called them Vera systems, or Vera heating. Most people didn't know that they came from a girl who'd been exiled for theft, but the systems worked, and they saved lives. They reduced fuel consumption by 40 to 50%. They made winters survivable in ways that had previously required leaving the region entirely. Now, here's the part that gets me. In 1892, when Vera was 20 and had been working as a blacksmith's apprentice for about 5 years, the territorial government, aware of her work, aware of how many lives had been saved by her systems, offered her a position. They wanted her to travel to settlements, to consult on heating systems, to train other craftspeople. It was an unprecedented opportunity for a woman on the frontier. It was recognition of the highest order. Vera turned it down. She said she wanted to stay in her settlement. She said she wanted to keep working with Ulrich, and she said she wanted to keep teaching the next generation directly. She said there was more work to do locally than she could accomplish in a lifetime, and that was enough for her. There was a wisdom in that decision, a recognition that staying and deepening her work in one place might be more valuable than spreading herself thin across a territory. She married Ketil's grandson in 1894. His name was Soren, and he understood the value of what she did. They had 4 children. She continued working with copper and heat systems. She mentored dozens of people. She modified her designs based on what she learned from each implementation. People came from hundreds of miles away to learn from her. By the time she died in 1957, lived to be 84 years old, she'd influenced heating systems across the entire northern United States and into Canada. Vera heating systems kept communities warm. Vera heating systems meant that children survived winters that would have killed them. Vera's work meant that the frontier became survivable in ways it hadn't been before. And here's what I want you to think about. When she was 14 and exiled, the settlement thought they were protecting themselves from chaos. They thought they were maintaining order by removing someone who wouldn't follow rules. They didn't understand that she was trying to solve a problem because they weren't in the mindset to understand that. Their fear made them cruel. And when she came back, she could have been angry. She could have refused to help. She could have let them freeze. No one would have blamed her. The settlement's cruelty would have deserved that consequence, but she didn't. She helped, and because she helped, the settlement survived that winter. And because the settlement survived, the knowledge she'd created was preserved and spread. And because the knowledge spread, hundreds of other people in hundreds of other communities survived winters that would have killed them without her heating systems. My granddad used to say that the difference between innovation and chaos is communication. Vera had the innovation. The settlement had a need for order. What was missing was the bridge between them. When that bridge was finally built, when Vera actually taught them instead of just experimenting in secret, and when the settlement was willing to learn instead of just enforce rules, everything changed. The other thing my granddad said was that you can't manufacture resilience. It comes from people who are willing to solve hard problems in unfamiliar ways. And those people are usually dangerous until you understand what they're actually doing. So if you're watching this and you know someone who's asking weird questions, or building something unconventional, or testing ideas that don't fit into standard practice, pay attention. They might be making a mistake, or they might be the only thing standing between your community and catastrophe. You might not understand them at first. You might not see why what they're doing matters. But that's often how genius looks from the inside, like rebellion, like waste, like someone not following the rules. What I want to know is this. In your own life, has there been a time when someone you thought was wrong turned out to be right? Not right in a way you expected, but right in a way that actually mattered? Drop a comment and tell me about it, because that's the pattern. That's always been the pattern. And subscribe if you want more stories like this. These are the real engineering stories, not the famous engineers we all know about, but the people who solved problems because they had to, and because understanding how things work was more important to them than being comfortable. Take care of yourselves.